Okay, thank you so much for your patience. I think our participants have been able to check in. Usually we start these webinars saying it's a great pleasure to see all of you here, but in many ways, I think, unfortunately, it would have made much better if we didn't need to have this discussion here tonight. But we cannot shy away from important discussions like this. We have all witnessed the horrors that people in Ukraine are experiencing. And since I'm here, I'm Torbjörn Becker, I'm the director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics in Stockholm. And I'm joined here tonight by several of our colleagues in the Free Network, and also Larry Samuelson, who's not only here in the network, but also a professor at Yale. But the thing is that when we are faced with the situation like this in Ukraine, as economists, we are always thinking, can we do something? Can we think about something? And of course, one of the most widely discussed topics that economists are involved in today is the one about sanctions against Russia for the aggression in Ukraine. So this will now be the focus here in this webinar this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm of course very happy that we can get the inputs from Nataliia Shapoval, who is running the KC Institute. The Kyiv School of Economics in Ukraine is one of the important members of our free network. And of course, Nataliia has been working over the last couple of years to really make a difference when it comes to policy analysis of important issues in Ukraine. And she's still now, under these circumstances, thinking about ways of helping her country. So thank you, Nataliia, for being with us here tonight. I'm also joined here by Larry Samuelson, as I said. He's not only a professor at Yale, he's also on the International Academic Board of the Kyiv School of Economics. Thank you for joining us, Larry. We also have Tamar Sulukhia from ISET in Georgia. Tamar is the director both of ISET and of ISET PI in Georgia. Welcome, Tamara. We have Lev. Lev Lvovsky is a research fellow at BEROC, which is our sister institution in Belarus. But Lev is not in Belarus currently, but in a more safe location, let's put it this way. And then last but not least, for sure, is Yaroslava Babych from ISET Policy Institute. And we also have Maria Perotta Berlin from SITE here in Stockholm, who's been putting together this interesting panel for tonight. I will not, as I usually do, speak too much here in the introduction. I think we are all quite eager to hear the updates from Nataliia in Ukraine. So what we're going to do is that we're going to let Nataliia start to give her picture of the situation and her views on the sanction discussion. Then Larry will present some ideas that have been put together by the International Academic Board and other close friends of the Kyiv School of Economics. We will have then some inputs both from Georgia and Belarus when it comes to thinking about sanctions. And then, of course, we will have an open discussion here where you can contribute your comments and questions in the Q&A function that is available. But I will certainly stop now. And Nataliia, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, Torbjörn. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting to this event. So right now I'm near Kiev, but it's more or less calm here. Our analytical team is in very different places. Somebody is in Kiev, somebody was mobilized and with weapons, sleep deprived and trying to protect Kiev city and now other cities too. Some people are in the Western Ukraine where for now it's more or less safe, but some are in quite hot parts of Ukraine, like in Sumy or Kharkiv, and some lost connection with their parents. So it's pretty hectic. But our morale and state of our mood is quite high. Everyone is fighting against Russia with all the tools that we have. We fight for our basically, we just don't want to allow anybody, any criminal like Putin to decide for us anything, to decide whether we should leave, how we should leave, what we should do, what we should think. It's our right to decide on our own, and we will not allow otherwise. I just was in the center of this small city where I am, and there are queues of men standing to get mobilized and join the military forces. So everyone is working. Our team of analysts, they have, most of us have very little use in warfare. We mostly can do only, keyboard stuff, do things on computer tables. So we do all kinds of, logistics coordination, fundraising, monitoring of what's going on with the economy, what's the damages, coming up with ideas about sanctions and demands to international community or politicians. So there are many ends that are working towards one goal. We've been monitoring sanctions and thinking of them even before like this massive military action started. And as of now, my perspective is that sanctions are unfortunately necessary evil. They don't change the crazy mind of Putin, but unfortunately they are important to reduce resources to conduct war and to inform regular Russian people that what's going on is serious. Unfortunately, they are isolated from the objective information by their media channels, and there are a lot of repressions inside of Russia against those who are trying to share correct information in the media or who are coming to protest. So the economic effects is something that should signal that it is very serious. And the third important objective of sanctions is to show that all countries, all leaders of the world, they are united in fighting this evil represented right now by Putin, and they are seriously protecting civilians and democracy and free choice of people in Europe. As of now, there are plenty of sanctions against individuals in Russia, against the reserves of their central bank, against the banks. There are trade restrictions of all kinds. There are the SWIFT final restrictions. So, and more fundamentally, and something that I didn't expect would happen, frankly, is that Nord Stream 2 was stopped, and or at least for some period of time, and Germany started And more generally, I would say Europe started diversifying their energy resources and stopped using the oil and gas from Russia. That's really a big deal, which signals that all these countries are very seriously like involved in this fight. So that's, I think, some brief overview, Toby. I would not go into details. We have like the whole list of sanctions that have been implemented by all countries. As I said, I think the most important is what's going on with energy, what's all the isolation of individuals and from financial transactions and from and assets of Russia as a government and of individual companies. And of course, it's not part of the sanctions, but for us in Ukraine, it's the most important is that military support is coming. So it's not the subject of the discussion, but it's really, really like paramount priority for us. Yeah, thanks. Over. That's for start, and direct me how to proceed.
Thank you, Nataliia. I think we should hand over to Larry now and give us a more maybe in-depth discussion of sanctions and what can be useful and what is sort of missing today. So Larry, I give the floor to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. First, a general comment about sanctions. Sanctions can be effective, but sanctions are a rather blunt instrument. Sanctions impose costs on Russian people. Sanctions impose costs on those doing the sanctioning. It would be nice if we could pursue this without having those people to make those sacrifices, but there is no feasible way to do that, and so we have to live and work with this rather blunt instrument. Second thing to note is that sanctions alone are not a panacea. Sanctions alone are not going to resolve this. Sanctions can make it more difficult for Russia to pursue its current course of action. Sanctions can slow the progress of that course of action. Sanctions can buy us some time, but in the end, sanctions are going to have to be supplemented by other sorts of measures. The sanctions themselves we can divide into three categories. The sanctions that will be felt most immediately, that we already see having an impact, are sanctions on financial transactions in the financial sector in Russia. These, in turn, we can think of in three parts. One is sanctions on the Russian central bank. The Russian central bank over the last decades has built up its reserves. It appears as if this has been with an eye towards insulating the Russian economy from the rest of the world. The central bank now has somewhat more than $600 billion in reserves, but many of these are not very liquid and will be restricted by sanctions. We see the effects of this in the fall in the value of the ruble, the increase in interest rates in Russia, the restrictions on money flows in and out of Russia. All of this reflects the sanctions that various countries have placed on the central bank. Second step is sanctions on other aspects of the Russian banking system. The most significant one here is the removal of these banks from the SWIFT network. So it's more difficult for these banks to engage in international transactions. And then the third tier is sanctions on other Russian assets, divestment of funds in the rest of the world from Russian assets, withdrawal of investments in Russia. Altogether, these financial assets or these financial sanctions we see having an immediate impact on the Russian economy. Second tier of sanctions I would refer to as as trade sanctions. We can think of these as going both ways. In terms of imports, Russia imports much of the technology that it uses for various industrial, including military purposes, and restrictions on those will have an effect. It will take longer than is the case with the financial sanctions. On the other end, Nataliia pointed to some very important sanctions. Russia's exports are dominated by energy and metals, energy, oil, and natural gas. Much of Russia's earnings, its foreign currency earnings, come from exporting energy and metals. And so reductions in those exports, other countries turning away from buying energy and metals, especially energy from Russia, will have a real impact on their economy. This is very costly for those imposing the sanctions. These costs can be mitigated somewhat by other countries increasing production of energy, other countries tapping their strategic reserves of energy, and other countries looking at ways to diversify away from those sources of energy. We see, for example, Germany is now going to build 2 new liquefied natural gas receiving stations, which will diversify their energy options quite a bit. But that's going to take a long time to come on board. So by limiting imports to Russia, we can impede their ability to both run the economy and run the military operation. By decreasing our purchases of exports, especially energy from Russia, we can decrease their access to foreign reserves, their access to the rest of the world. These will be effective. They will take longer than that, longer than the financial sanctions. The third tier of sanctions, I don't have a better word for than sanctions of inconvenience, but these are measures such as denying Russian air traffic, airspace over other countries, withdrawing from cultural and athletic cooperation with Russia, restricting movements of various Russian officials, perhaps providing information about Russian assets in the rest of the world, the reduction of tourism with Russia, all steps to disconnect Russia a bit from the rest of the world. These are important for symbolic purposes. Some of them will have real impacts. They will be less important than the trade and the financial sanctions. Many of these sanctions are already in place. There have been some real surprises. Switzerland has departed from a long-standing neutrality policy to join in some of the sanctions. Germany has canceled its plans for its pipeline. Germany has delayed decommissioning of its nuclear facilities. These are significant policy changes from these countries. And so we have significant buy-in in the sanctions already. There is still quite a bit of room for both extending and tightening the sanctions. Some Russian banks are excluded from the SWIFT network, some are not. More of them could be. More countries could join these sanctions. Sanctions could be extended perhaps to Belarus or other countries that are complicit in the Russian adventure. Anytime a sanction is put in place, incentives arise to evade that sanction. And so there's scope for monitoring Russian financial transactions to look for routes that they are looking for around the sanctions. So we can make them more comprehensive, we can make them tighter, and the greater is the extent to which we can do that, the greater and the quicker will be the effect of these sanctions. I'll stop the summary there and
thank you, Larry. Yes, very useful. Thank you. I'm going to save my own and the audience questions for once we have made the other introductions. several things to come back to there for sure. Lev, can I get some inputs from your horizon? And I'm guessing it's going to be connected to Belarus here.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I work in BEROC, Belarusian Economic Research and Outreach Center. After the political crisis of 2020, we were actually forced to leave, and we, as a center, moved to Ukraine. And so now we are moving the second time. I personally was super lucky because I went for a short vacation to Georgia right before the war started. But the rest of the colleagues spent quite a lot of time trying to get out of Ukraine, and some are still in Ukraine and are thinking to join territorial defense. I will, yes, as Torbjörn said, talk a little bit about sanctions on Belarus and how old sanctions will work together probably with new sanctions and what can we expect, although I should say that it's hard to make any clear predictions nowadays as all the things happen super fast. We have several sanctions a day probably. So predictions hold very soon. So as a background, Belarus already had a lot of sanctions, but they were first enacted with lag in time. They touched potash products, but not all of them, about 30% of them. And Belarus is one of the largest producers of potash oil products, foreign credit, which made problems with national debt, tobacco producing, nitra, fertilizers, tires, bans on air traffic. Overall, goods sanctions applied to about 5% of GDP. But we expected that Belarus would lose maybe up to 1% of GDP because some of these products Belarus was able to reroute and sell to other markets, probably at some discount. There were also some sanctions with regard to services, especially air traffic and transit. They amounted to about 0.5% of GDP, and services would be lost in its entirety. How war affected Belarus? Alexander Lukashenko claims that he is a third party in this war and that Belarus is a neutral country, but it is clear that Russian attacks on Ukraine are also launched from the Belarusian territory. There are some Russian troops marching from Belarus, although it is unclear if Belarusian army actually participates by itself in the war. Therefore, we are likely to be joined in in most of the sanction lists with Russia. I guess in most sanctions, Belarus would come just right after Russia. And also an additional effect is that Russia is the biggest trade partner of Belarus. About 50% of foreign trade of Belarus is with Russia. So what are some of the effects that we'll have? Russian expert wrote that Belarus was going to use to avoid some of the previous European Union and US sanctions will probably not work, or at least not work as well as Belarus thought they would, because now Russian experts would be under sanctions. As I said, Russia is an important trade partner, and Russian ruble depreciation and Russian ruble variability, of course, negatively affects Belarus. It brings Belarusian ruble with itself. Other countries are fine with most of countries are fine with the currency depreciation. Your imports become a little bit more expensive, your exports become a little bit more competitive. So overall, there is no disaster. But with Belarus, it's a very different story. Most of Belarusian debt is in foreign currency, and debt of major state-owned enterprises too. So when currency depreciates, it becomes much harder to pay back on their debt. Amount of Russian support that will be provided to Belarus, that Russia promised to provide, is questionable. So here, of course, we cannot say anything. It is possible that due to hardships in Russian economy, Russia will stop supporting Belarus, or at least support less. It is also possible that in return for using Belarusian territory to attack Ukraine, Vladimir Putin promised something to Alexander Lukashenko. So it could be that Russian support will even increase in theory. There are new sanctions. There are a lot of them. Sanctions, as Larry Samuelson said, come from countries, international organizations, but also from just private companies, because Russia and Belarus became toxic. So I would say that the most important sanctions among product sanctions that came so far in the first 7 days of the war are ban on metals export, rubber products export, wood products export, and cement. There are, of course, many smaller sanctions. There also will be further restrictions, increase in sanctions on tobacco, mineral fuels, potash. We don't know details yet. There are already sanctions on several banks. Again, as Russian banks face new sanctions, and some of them even face that they will be switched off the SWIFT system. Probably it will apply to some of Belarusian banks as well. And when everybody talk about SWIFT, it means bank panic. You don't know if your bank will be switched off or not. So people run to their bank and try to get their deposits. So it means new problems with liquidity in the financial system. It is, of course, super hard to estimate what will be the effect of these newly imposed sanctions. My very on the back of the envelope estimate is that new sanctions will add, will decrease Belarusian GDP by at least 2%. Additionally to the old sanctions, again, we don't know yet how, for example, new potash sanctions will work with old potash sanctions. Will they cross out loopholes that Belarus used to have? And probably even more important than sanctions on some particular goods exports is super toxicity, or at least I would claim so. Super toxicity means that you cannot form expectations about future. Any interaction with foreign goods, with foreign services, with foreign countries can be at question. If you can order Bolt or other taxi cab today, it doesn't mean that it will still work tomorrow. If you can go, if you can go watch a movie, football, subscribe for Netflix, everything can disappear. Order foreign goods, use credit cards, buy certain foreign cars. Flights, work on a factory, which, for example, used to, for example, Belarus wood factories were quite successful in previous years, but now with these new sanctions, again, everything will probably disappear. So basically, anytime when your business idea or your life touches foreign grounds, and if you live in Belarus, it means that you cannot be sure that you still will have this option next day or next week. Making any, I wrote here 5-year business plan. I guess even 1-year business plan is quite questionable nowadays. And this is probably the most important effect, because with previous sanctions, for example, when Europe was stating that they will not buy Belarusian potash, it meant that Belarus could start thinking about ways to avoid sanctions. For example, India, well, before the war, said that they agreed to buy Belarusian potash while there were some issues with transportation. But now probably it is enough that one newspaper will write that your company is buying something from Belarus or Russia or selling something to Belarus or Russia, and you would be likely to retreat and to say that now you enact your own personal corporate sanctions. So something like this, a lot of uncertainty, and of course, horrible war and horrible relationships with our neighbors in future. One thing that I didn't put here is not sanctions, but well, an outcome of the war. Ukraine also was a very important export market for Belarus. About $2 billion in oil products per year. And now, of course, well, right now, of course, Ukraine is not buying, and I don't know if it would be possible to repair international relationships between Belarus and Ukraine at some point in time, probably not in some near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Lev. Very interesting summary. I'm going to hand over to Tamara to give us some perspective from Georgia. Unfortunately, your country has already been through a Russian invasion, and you had also to deal actually with sanctions from Russia. But Tamara, would you like to introduce us a little bit to the Georgian perspective?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I think before my colleague Yaroslava, Babych will talk about economic implications. I think I would like to give you probably the 3-minute overview of the historic process in Georgia, which is very relevant to today's events in Ukraine in 2 ways. First, as Torbjörn said, the 20% of my country of Georgia is occupied by Russia since 2008, and that started much earlier in 90s. So this is relevant in that sense that since outbreak of the current tragic events and war in Ukraine, Russian-Ukrainian war, everybody was saying that the scenario is unfolding like events in Georgia in 2008. So on one hand, that's relevant from that perspective. And the second, it somewhat explains the national position or the position of the Georgian government towards joining various sanctions and voting on various international floors, reacting to the ongoing war in Ukraine. So just to say very briefly, the breakout of Soviet Union and declaring of independence by Georgia soon resulted into territories of two autonomous republics, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, in early 90s to be de facto controlled by Russia, by so-called peacekeepers of Russia. So that started in 90s. And then since 2003, with Rose Revolution in Georgia, Georgian-Russian relations have been fast deteriorating, reaching culmination in August of 2008. And from August 1 in 2008, South Ossetia, Georgian villages were shelled from South Ossetia territories. And then in 2007, on August 7, Georgia declared that the military forces of Russia have crossed the Rocky Tunnel, the Russian-Georgian border. However, the EU fact-finding mission has concluded that it was not in a position to consider Georgian claims substantiated. This basically resulted in next day, August 8, on Russia accusing Georgia on aggression towards peaceful population of Autonomous Republic of Ossetia. I hope this reminds you of the current case, and started a full-scale aggression in Georgia. And this was land, air, and sea aggression on the claim that it was keeping peace and protecting peaceful population. And by the way, Russia attacked Georgia beyond South Ossetia's territories. There was also a very major information war, which Georgia pretty much lost at that point. Georgia was supported, definitely. Ukrainian president, French president, others were in Tbilisi that most important night when the Russian tanks were heading towards Tbilisi, and they were 40 kilometers away from Tbilisi. On August 12, French President Sarkozy negotiated ceasefire agreement. So basically, where we stand right now is that we have Georgian internally displaced people from South Ossetia still unable to return. As I said already, 20% of the country being occupied. In 2021, European Court of Human Rights ruled that Russia maintained direct control over the separatist regions and was responsible for grave human rights abuses. Yet, Russian tanks are 40 kilometers away from Tbilisi in South Ossetia, which basically is a sovereign territory of Georgia. So that basically gives us a flavor of the history a little bit and continuity. While there was no due response in 2008, the aggression has now reached a much higher and stronger scale. So Georgia being aspiring towards NATO and European Union, basically still is in pain of having its territories occupied by Russia. So that's sets a context a little bit for Georgia's position. And I will be very happy to talk much more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Yaroslava, would you like to share some thoughts with us?
Sure. Just my internet connection may be unstable. If it is, I will switch off my camera and speak like that. So as Tamara said, yes, indeed, Georgia has very complicated relationship with Russia. And right now, of course, 25% is occupied of its territory. And there is, because of these scars, there is a very strong popular sentiment overwhelmingly against Russian political establishment. I'm not saying against Russians because there is, quite a lot of connections and tourism, and people distinguish between at this point between ordinary people and what is the government's position. But Georgians have, for example, just in 2019, gone to the streets in a mass protest to protest one Russian MP coming to parliament in Tbilisi and sitting in the chair of the Speaker of the Parliament, which was against the protocol. So this Gavrilov, who was the MP, was Sergei Gavrilov, was the trigger for these mass protests. And this explains why right now in Georgia there is huge popular support for Ukraine and for sanctions against Russia. And there is a mass outpouring of support from businesses. So businesses have been sending aid, have been telling that we will host Ukrainian refugees for free. Even people who got stuck in Georgia while on vacation, they can transfer money without the fees. They can live in hotels without paying anything. So there is just a massive wave of popular support in Georgia. But still, I mean, Georgia is very vulnerable to both Russian ire, if it comes to that, I mean, or to just the sanctions themselves, because of the strong economic ties that have existed in the past and still exist. So currently the economic picture is the following. If energy price hike, which is already happening and is likely to be bigger even in the future, Georgia stands to lose from that. So currently the annual inflation in Georgia is about 13.7%, which is way above what the target inflation is. And about 3.7 percentage points of this is from the increase in gas, electricity, so energy prices. So there is a 46% annual increase as of January 2022. And if energy prices are going to increase by 20% more, this is likely to add 2 more percentage points to inflation. About this is, but on the whole, Georgia doesn't depend so much as Europe does on Russian gas and Russian electricity. Only 7% of Georgian gas consumption comes from Russia. Only 4.5% of electricity consumption comes from Russian imports. But of course, the increase in the prices are going to affect Georgian consumers. Second, wheat prices. Well, here Georgia is very exposed to the Russian market. 87% of wheat comes from Russia. And of course, nobody bans at this point imports of wheat from Russia, but still, the increase in prices, which is happening right now, is going to affect Georgian consumers. So Georgia, by the way, doesn't subsidize bread prices. So that means that currently the poor population is the most vulnerable, because much of the calories of an average person in Georgia comes from actually bread, and the increase in bread prices will be could be quite painful for the vulnerable population. So Georgian government has to be ready for that. Now, number 3 is SWIFT. SWIFT ban on certain Russian banks will have implication for, of course, exports and imports. Currently, Russia is one of the top, importers and exporters in Georgia. So if Russian exports and imports disappear, totally, let's say extreme scenario, this would create a gap of $500 million in the balance of payments. Still, this is, still some analysts say that the effect of Russian sanctions are not going to be as dramatic as, for example, the COVID was. So COVID, during COVID height of the pandemic, Georgian economy was minus 7% growth rate. Right now, the country is recovering from the pandemic, so growth is expected to be positive. And the Russian sanctions are expected to shave off about between 1.5 to 3% of the GDP growth. So there is still a chance that Georgia will end up with a positive balance in growth, but it will have a dent definitely in the country's economy. Other vulnerable areas are tourism and remittances, but in the recent years they have been the importance of Russian remittances in Georgia has been going down. If in 2008 the share of Russian remittances in the Georgian total money inflows was 60%, now it's around 19%. So it's not as big of a source anymore. So I would be happy to answer questions, because there is a lot of there are a lot of things to be talked about, but in a nutshell, this is this is the big picture for the Georgian economy.
Thank you, Yaroslava. I would like us to get into some discussions about how we think about sanctions. I mean, I would like to start throwing out the question just that, why didn't we learn the lesson from what happened in Georgia, and why didn't we impose stronger sanctions on Russia there? I would just like to hear your views on, could that potentially have helped prevent what's going on now in Ukraine? Or what is our sense on this? Or is it just the case that Putin cares nothing about the economy? And it's just us economists and people around the world that don't want to go to war that think this will work? I think Larry, Nataliia, would you like to start? You have been quiet for a long time now.
Sure, I will. First note that sanctions are most often imposed in response to some provocation or some crisis. Much more rarely are sanctions used as a proactive measure to deter such activities. So I'm not too surprised that after we were done with Georgia, sanctions languished for a while and then suddenly come to the fore with this new provocation. One reason for that, I suspect, is that there is an impression that sanctions, again, are an imprecise instrument. And so they put pressure on leadership at the cost of citizens. And so people often shrink from doing that. Hard to say whether more severe or more pressing sanctions in the meantime would have prevented this. Now, more severe sanctions will surely help, but sanctions alone are not going to be enough. And so what we hope is that sanctions give us the opportunity to move to other measures as well.
Thank you, Nataliia.
Yeah, so right now, I think that the time we as some global community started tolerating Putin behavior from the very beginning, like all his authoritarian behavior in his country, repression of all kinds of human freedoms, and allowing him to control over the gas and the oil neighboring countries. We started tolerating, like getting used to the fact that he can invade other countries and being fine with that. It's something that going on, all the time. There are so many countries where there is hunger, wars, and so many injustice, and we just think that it's so many kilometers away from us. So, like, why should we care? And I think, and I didn't see that myself, I guess, but now it seems that the pattern of Putin's behavior was so clear so much time ago. And from the first time when he started killing innocent people, it should have been punished. Thanks, over.
Thank you, Nataliia. I was wondering, Maria, I know that you have been writing about sort of the effectiveness of sanctions in the past. I mean, not looking at this current crisis situation, but how do you want to guide us in terms of thinking about sanctions and how useful they can be or not?
Yeah, thanks for giving me this opportunity. I'm very very impressed by the contributions that we heard so far. My quick 50 cents on these are that I think it's not for sure that the sanctions will work, of course. Larry is also talking about other measures that unspecified, but that maybe we can talk more about later, that will complement. But I think the conventional wisdom is that sanctions that are imposed do not work, because if sanctions are powerful enough, they work at the threat stage. So if the threat is not working, a credible threat, then the imposition of sanctions will not deter the target. However, in this case, it seems like threats were not taken seriously, and that Putin was underestimating the reaction, and that he might have been surprised by this strong reaction and strong unity in reaction. So this gives some hope that in this case sanctions might work, even though they failed at the threat stage. This is my hope, at least. And then there's also the time dimension, of course, because in the short run, effects may be limited, but then they accumulate over time, and then that will be also a different, more painful story over the long run.
Thank you. I mean, I just have one small note on that, though, that we all often say sanctions don't work because we think about sanctions as a way of changing policies, and that's kind of the more hopeful interpretation of sanctions, maybe. But I mean, in some ways, sanctions is also a way of actually punishing a country or a leadership that is doing something that is unacceptable to the world. So, in that sense, I think a lot of the sanctions discussions is about it didn't change behavior, but I mean, if we think about North Korea, Iran, or Cuba, etc., I mean, sanctions certainly imposed very severe economic cost. I mean, well beyond sort of the 1% here or there that we may think of as an initial response to sanctions. So I would just like to hear your view maybe on how should we think about sanctions working or not working? I mean, what are the relevant dimensions we should evaluate sanctions from, do you think? Anyone want to pick up that line of thought?
If I may, the Iranian sanctions, I think, are a very interesting case. There, the sanctions had quite drastic effect on the Iranian economy, but they were paired with the prospect of a negotiated nuclear deal that would lead to the lifting of sanctions. And so I think the Iranian sanctions were effective because they coupled the stick of the sanctions with the carrot of an agreement that would allow the Iranian economy to open. And this is why I say that it's difficult for sanctions alone to work. Just wielding the stick is a hard way to do it, especially when you're dealing with something like military action. And it would be very helpful to find the other piece of that in this case.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this topic?
Oh, I may add a little bit. So we get used to think about sanctions, if they work or not, as this dummy variable, which can be either 0 or 1. Either there are sanctions or no sanctions. But most sanctions that are enacted, that were enacted in history, were rather small, and they were just maybe showing a relationship rather than making actual effect. If in return to your bad actions, we decrease your salary by 1%, then yes, it is minus, but it is not something that should really make you think twice. So Larry's example with Iranian sanctions is good, because Iranian sanctions were actually swift, they were drastic, and they were very clear what Iran should do to avoid them, what it should not do. For example, if we compare it with sanctions towards Belarus, since 2020, sanctions were taking a long time to be enacted. They were kind of sloppy in terms of what are they for, what do they punish for, and they were also rather small. So at the end, we expected Belarusian economy to suffer from 0.5 to 1% additional decrease from sanctions. Yes, it is economic cost, but it is not a serious cost if you are a dictator and your fate is at stake.
Thank you.
I may add.
Yes, please, Nataliia.
I think the effect is like expected effect is isolation. So in our like financial etc. term, like social isolation, when we don't accept some kind of behavior, and in the same way, economic isolation. I totally agree with you that it's punishment, and the effect should be, even if it doesn't heal the criminal like Putin, it still has like very specific target, and I would call it isolation, and probably creation of direct effect on constituency, on people who vote and support the regime.
Perhaps.
Thank you. Yes.
Quick comment here. Sanctions, I think, two sides of the coin, or maybe same side. One is the cost, right? Economic cost as a punishment. But also sanctions is the message. And here we are talking about impact on Russia, but these sanctions also have impact on Ukraine. This is the expression of solidarity, and this is the expression that world stands with Ukraine. So this is this benefit of the messaging side, which could be as strong to help Ukrainian people to fight against aggression as they can be as economic cost on Russia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm going to go through a few of the questions and comments that we have received from the audience now. So I think we have one question for you, Larry, to start out, which is pretty straight up, which is about you explaining the sanctions of inconvenience, what you were thinking about. And maybe I want to add now that, I mean, we are looking at, as of today, the Russian and Belarusian team has been kicked out of the Paralympics, and I think that kind of fits into that general category. So your views on this, Nate?
Yes, to be clear, sanctions of inconvenience is an idiosyncratic term. I use that for want of a better one. I don't mean to be flippant when I say inconvenience. And this refers to a collection of sanctions that are not neatly classified as either financial or trade related. It includes things like denying access to airspace to Russian airlines, prohibiting Russian officials from traveling abroad, withdrawing sporting events from Russia. The Champions League is not going to play its final in St. Petersburg. In addition to the Paralympics, gymnastics and tennis federations have taken steps to exclude Russian participation. It can include restrictions on banking transactions by individual Russians abroad. All sorts of indications or all sorts of ways of indicating that Russia is not freely connected to the rest of the world as it used to be. Some of these are symbolic, but as the previous speaker noted, the symbolism can be very important here, and some of these will have real effects.
Thank you. I think this connects quite well to a comment from Cameron Khudur, who is one of our guests listening in and contributing the thoughts here on sanction, which is that a lot of the countries that we use as examples of when sanctions didn't work, like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, people in those countries were actually not used to travel abroad and be part of Western societies in the ways that Russians are now today. So, you know, these types of sanctions will actually be felt in a much different way in Russia than they have been in these other countries. So, I mean, this could be sort of really making us, we need to sort of rethink sort of the sanctions history in other countries, because Russia is a more particular case here. I'm going to move over to a question from Ian Anthony. He's talking about Singapore and Switzerland are normally only implementing sanctions under UN resolutions, but there's also the alternative discourse taking place in India and Turkey, where sanctions are described as replacing military power as the contemporary instruments of Western imperialism. So how can these countries be brought on board to support the sanctions that we're discussing here today? And then he adds, of course, that Singapore and Switzerland are now supporting the US, EU, UK sanctions, to be clear. So, I mean, the question is really, how can countries like India and Turkey also sort of join the sanctions against Russia in the current circumstances? Does anyone have any thoughts on this? I think it's a quite complicated issue, and I would not be able to really answer this in any particular way.
I'll contribute a partial answer. It's an important and difficult question. The one thing I suggest is to look at the example of Hungary, which has in the past been a great supporter of Russia and Putin. And in recent days, we've seen much more nuanced statements coming from the leadership there. And that might serve as an example in how we can think of bringing countries that are ordinarily skeptical of Western foreign policy or Western imperialism, as the questioner says, how we might bring them on board.
So, I mean, this sort of ties into a question from our colleague Giancarlo Spagnolo that is listening in, which is how much can the support from China dilute the effects of sanctions that the West is now imposing? And will this basically mean that Russia and China will be less exposed at the end of this to sort of Western pressures if we think ahead? And of course, again, he's reiterating that India is also still supporting Russia. So, I mean, are we just making ourselves a very strong enemy in the combination of sort of Russia and China joining forces, and then really, even in the end game, supplanting Western powers from sort of ruling the world, if you want to take it all the way down that route?
Well, I can try to answer.
Please, Lev.
So first, I think that it is a dream of every dictator that when US is against you, China will help you and buy all your products and everything else. But reality that we observe is that, yes, in most cases, China, for example, in the United Nations, does not vote together with Western countries. But in many cases, it's not supporting Russia or Belarus either. Recently, China, of course, didn't join sanctions against Russia, but we've already heard several news when large Chinese banks decline transactions to and from Russia. For China, China is, first of all, a huge economy. And it means that the Chinese interests in trade with US, in trade with Europe, are much larger than Chinese interests in interactions with Russia. So indeed, they don't have, let's call it, European and Western feelings. They would not impose sanctions because you killed somebody or because you just started a war. But it doesn't mean that they will support Putin instead of having good relationships with the US.
Thank you. I actually wanted to share with you one slide just to put things in a little bit this perspective, which is this is a picture of the size of the different economies of the world. I'm going to put it in full screen mode. So what you can see here is basically the GDP of different countries, and the US being the largest economy of the world. If you look at market exchange rates, China is actually the largest one if you look at PPP adjusted exchange rate GDP. But as you can see down this list, Russia is in the ballpark of Canada or Italy. And I mean, I'm sitting here in Sweden. We only have 10 million people, and Russia is only 2.5 times the size of the Swedish economy. And Russia has 142 million people or something like that. So, you know, I would definitely agree with Lev that if China has to make a calculation of it, should be staying friends with the European Union and the US, which is still the big economic areas of this world, or make closer ties with Russia, which is a tiny economy. I mean, I think China really has to think hard if it's worth sort of their political ambitions and other things in exchange for losing out in markets like the US and Europe. And this is really going to be an interesting issue to follow, I think, in the next couple of weeks and months, to see how China managed to deal with this quite delicate trade-off between political lining up with Russia and potentially losing out in the big markets of the US and the EU. And of course, this was, again, the Economist in me speaking, hoping that sort of this economic rationale will also be important when we think about ways of solving these international conflicts. So I want to ask my friends here in the panel, what else do you think are the important issues that we need to be considering here? I mean, one dimension that I certainly think about, that I also think a lot of other people are thinking about, is who is going to control sort of the narrative in Russia when it comes to both how this conflict started, but now also who is the villain when they are facing all of these sanctions, when people have to again line up outside of their banks to get their cash out, see the value of the ruble savings be cut in half or even worse. The Russian stock market has gone down the drain, basically. All of these things. I mean, how should we think about sort of the propaganda war, if you want, attached not only to the original conflict, but also now it's going to be attached to this sanctions discussion. So any thoughts on this?
I just wanted to share a little bit of perspective. You know, I was born during the Soviet Union, and I went to school, grew up essentially until I was 15. I was part of this Soviet school system, and I remember very well. I mean, in fact, you know, how we were brought up. So this informational load that was coming from official sources, how information was managed, but also how the sentiment of ordinary people was at the time. So what ordinary people thought. I don't think that people in Russia quite trust their government 100%. What the information is coming to them now about a special operation that you know, with just a few losses, very soon it would be plain to see for everybody that this is not the case. This was in fact the Afghanistan story. I mean, when Soviet Union got involved in Afghanistan, and everybody knew that the consequences of war were much more serious than was presented to the public. Then with Chernobyl in Ukraine, after Chernobyl explosion happened, the Soviet government, of course, declined that it ever occurred, but people didn't trust. They knew something terrible was going on, and I think this is sort of like Chernobyl, you know, effect for the Russian public. You know, they know something terrible is going on. They might be getting some pieces of information, some rumors. Of course, some of them live in their own echo chambers, but I think these sanctions will be, you know, bringing a different level of awareness to them. That, you know, for some reason, even China is abstaining from voting in the Security Council, in the UN General Assembly. So I think they will have an effect. Maybe not as fast as we would hope, but eventually they will.
Thank you. Maybe Nataliia, can I ask you a little bit about sort of how's the propaganda war looking from your horizon, and maybe not only focus on the war part of it, but also the sanctions discussion and propaganda related to that.
My perspective would come from several sources. One is, I guess, general information from media, social network, etc. And I have a new habit of reading, there is Office of President of Russia website, and they put transcript of all their meetings. Very interesting reading. And then I have relatives in Russia, and some of our colleagues from, so Ukrainians who happen to be in Russia working in their businesses and who left there. So if I would come from like regular people perspective, then Russia has more than 190 different ethnic groups. And in fact, there is very little in common between them. So I have like one part of my family lives in Siberia. They never had anything, in common with what was going on in Moscow. And right now they have regular Moscow filtered channels, but their perspective is very like humane. So they think that, okay, politicians do something, but war is bad. But they afraid to protest because they never did anything like that. And these ethnic groups, they have their own history. They never had wars that they won or protests that they won. And then in Moscow, one of my relatives, actually in military in Russia, and he sends us video saying that all these Ukrainian fascists, they should die, even ignoring the fact that his father, who is Soviet general, is in Ukraine and is also near the shooting. So it's so among these groups of military, police, etc. My perspective is that there is nothing rational left, and it's like years of consistent work on their brain to make them think in a certain way. And I don't believe that anything can be done to people like this, my relative. And then what I see from like media and colleagues is that like people like us in social demographic terms, they have sources how to see what's going on, and they might have doubts, they have, but more or less they understand what's going on, but they're just afraid, and they don't have any kind of, maybe it should be in DNA to fight like Ukrainians do. And they totally don't have, even when they have like more or less credible and accurate sources of information. Over. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, one scary piece of news that I saw, and I haven't read it myself, so but I'm hoping it's correct, is that Foreign Minister Lavrov in Russia had stated that this was a result of the West being the new Napoleons and Hitlers destroying Europe, and then going on to say that they were now going to teach kids in school that NATO poses a significant military threat to Russia, which, from my perspective, is a very nasty and unpleasant part of this propaganda and information war. And I mean, if we start to think about educating children in to sort of not trusting or feeling scared about sort of other countries, that's not the happy future for our world, for sure. But I hope that we in the rest of the world can refrain from these kind of messages, simplified and crude, to our children at least, and try to give them a more sensible view of our neighbors. But I just want to ask our panelists, do you have any questions to each other before we sort of round off this webinar? I think we have learned quite a lot about sanctions and the views from different parts of our network here today, but I want to give you a chance to share some final thoughts, or maybe put up some questions of your own. Tamara.
Thanks, Torbjörn. A quick comment. I think we see that history repeats itself, and this should be a lesson. The way Russia invaded in 2008 and explained to its population and the future generation was that this invasion was to protect peaceful population in South Ossetia. Now, the same rhetoric is happening, that the reason for invading Ukraine is to protect peaceful population of so-called DNR and LNR, which means Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. And I'm very happy to see that this time world stands united. There are no questions who is wrong and right in entire civilized world. And I hope that this is working. And my best wishes and wholehearted, warmest greetings to entire population of Ukraine from here in Tbilisi.
Thank you, Tamara. Any other thoughts from our panelists?
I'll just echo that. It does seem as if we have a pattern, and so it suggests that this is not going to stop here if we don't take measures to make it stop here. I wish I had something more optimistic to finish with.
Thank you, Larry. I will then just take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers for this webinar here tonight. I see that Nataliia has left the webinar now. I think she may have more pressing issues to think about and handle right now. I want all of our friends in Ukraine, of course, to know that we pray that you are safe down there in whatever religion we have. I don't really have one, but I still pray for your safety. And I thank all of you, Larry, Tamara, Yaroslava, Lev, Maria, and of course the team that makes this all feasible technically. And of course to all of you that joined the webinar here as audience and put questions and comments into this discussion. So with this, I would just like to say thank you. We are going to continue the discussion about Ukraine. We're not losing sight of what's going on in Ukraine, so stay tuned. We will return for more topics related to these conflicts. And in the meantime, please, friends in Ukraine, stay safe. For you in Russia, please tell your government to stop the invasion right now. And until that happens, please stay safe. And thank you for tonight. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!
Слава Україні!